Did you ever hear about that time in which the Apostle John went to the public baths? If not, you might find this to be a rather entertaining video, so I invite you to explore with me the story of John at the bathhouse. So what's the scoop here? What is the context? So this has to do with a story about John and Cerinthus, who is a character that we will discuss shortly. But in any case, where do we find this story? Around 180 CE, Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon wrote a book against heterodox Christians. So Irenaeus primarily attacked the Gnostics, such as the Valentinians. So his goal was to protect Orthodox doctrine against Gnostic doctrine. And one of his purposes in this book was to show how even the apostles themselves, as well as their disciples, opposed the famous heretics from the 1st and 2nd centuries. Again, these are people that are Gnostics, such as Valentinus or Ptolemy or Marcus or whoever, name your heretic, so to speak. And he tells a lot of stories about the apostles opposing these heretics. So one of the important things for understanding this story that we're going to see is that Irenaeus says that he studied under a bishop named Polycarp. And this Polycarp is supposed to have studied under the Apostle John. That's what Irenaeus says anyway. So we go from the Apostle John to Polycarp to Irenaeus. So what's going on here? Well, one of the heretics that Irenaeus criticizes was Cerinthus. So this guy, Cerinthus, was a teacher who was probably active from about 70 CE to 110 CE. Evidently, according to the sparse sources that we have, he was a sort of early Gnostic teacher who distinguished between the God of Israel and the God of Jesus. So the God of Israel was one God and the God of Jesus was another God. So it seems to be somewhat similar to the idea that Marcion would have later, but it seems like these two ideas arose independently. So in any case, before the Gospel of John had become well accepted among the Catholics, some apologists had claimed that Cerinthus the heretic wrote it. Okay, well, why would they do this? Well, the idea is that the Gospel of John circulated apparently, relatively early, maybe in the by the second half or by the first half of the 2nd century. And what happened is that a lot of these Gnostic Christians were using it. A lot of these heretical groups were using it. And so the Orthodox, that is the Catholics, the early Catholics, were not sure about whether they should be using the Gospel of John too, because so many of the Gnostics were using it. So you had two options. Either you would accept the Gospel of John and interpret it in a way that matches Catholic doctrine, or you would try to discredit the Gospel of John by saying that a Gnostic wrote it or something like that. So some of these apologists said that Cerinthus the heretic wrote it and that it shouldn't be used. But Irenaeus actually doesn't take this route. Instead, Irenaeus wants the Gospel of John to be accepted in the church because it's already being accepted in his community. So instead of talking about the authorship of Irenaeus, he understands that the Gospel of John is an Orthodox document and it's associated with the Apostle John, right? So he tells this story in his book Against the Heresies. So what he says is that Polycarp, his own teacher, is said to have told this story about John and Cerinthus. It's sort of like a story that contrasts John, who is teaching the truth, and Cerinthus, who is teaching the lie. And so according to Irenaeus, this is what he says. This is a translation of the story from his book Against Heresies. So there are also those who heard from him, that is Polycarp, that John, the disciple of the Lord, going to bathe at Ephesus, and perceiving Cerinthus within, rushed out of the bathhouse without bathing, exclaiming, "Let us fly, lest even the bathhouse fall down, because Cerinthus, the enemy of the truth, is within." Okay, so what just happens here? What happened here? Apparently, John was in Ephesus, and he was doing what people normally would do at this time. He would go to the public bath, and he wanted to take a bath at the public bath. But when he went there, he saw Cerinthus, the arch-heretic, the opposing teacher in there, and he was already bathing or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. Well, John decides to run out because he doesn't even want to bathe in the same house as Cerinthus, and he's screaming while he's running away, "Everybody get out, because you don't know if the the bathhouse will just topple down in order to crush the heretic because Cerinthus is inside of the house. So, obviously it's a little bit of a joke. The idea is that Cerinthus is teaching such horrible heresy that the judgment of God is just looming over him, so at any moment God could just knock a building down on top of him, and that would be the end of it. So it's actually kind of a funny story. So the question is, did Irenaeus hear this story from Polycarp himself, or did he just hear it from others that Polycarp used to tell this story? Well, what Irenaeus says is that there are also those who heard from him that John, the disciple of the Lord, etc., etc., etc. So I don't know if that seems to imply that Irenaeus has heard this story from other people, but it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense if Polycarp is in fact Irenaeus' teacher, that he wouldn't have heard this story from Polycarp himself. So, I don't know how to judge between the possibly conflicting details in that story, but it's something that I present to you to think about for yourself. But then another interesting question is, did this story actually happen? Well, it's really hard to say because this is the only account of this particular story, and it was written about maybe 100 years after it would have happened, which is not unheard of in the ancient world. It's actually quite common to have the sources for stories being written much longer after they were supposed to have taken place. But in any case, if it did happen, then John must have been a rather old man at this time, because it would have happened, maybe in the 80s, or even, the 90s. Well, that would be a little too long, but, somewhere between the 70s and the 80s CE that this would have happened. But there are traditions that John spent his last days in Ephesus. So the Acts of John, which you've seen featured on this channel many times, does say that the apostle spent his final days ministering in Ephesus. And what's interesting is that in that particular account, John himself actually does call upon the judgment of the Lord and knocks down the pagan temple of Diana there already. So it's not like John is unfamiliar with the idea of buildings being knocked down on top of people because of the judgment of God. So I don't know if there's a connection here between the Acts of John and this tradition that Irenaeus is preserving, but it's interesting to think about. So other sources tend to claim that Cerinthus was working there too, that he was working in Asia Minor. So the idea is that Cerinthus was originally from Egypt, but he moved up to Asia Minor in order to teach his particular version of, Gnostic Christianity, or whatever it was he was trying to teach. But overall, the information is rather scarce, and it would be interesting to do a more in-depth study of this story, but I thought I would just throw it out there and see what you all think. And these are some of the sources that I used. There's a pretty recent book by Litwa, which talks about some of these early heretics, and Cerinthus is featured in this book. And then you have the old translation of Irenaeus' works, which I commend to you. This, because it's from the 1800s, it can be had for free online, so I would highly recommend it. And then last of all, of course, is the edition of the Acts of John, since I happened to mention it. And so that's all there is for today's video, and I hope that you have a nice day.